Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video we are going to build the Weserflug P.1003/1 in 1/48 scale. But before we're going to do that, I would like to ask you to hit that subscribe and like button. I would greatly appreciate it. Now let's get on with it. First things first, let's try to close up the landing gears. And here we are in luck, because although Amusing Hobby didn't give the option for closed landing gears, not in the instructions, all the panels, all the doors and covers fit into their places perfectly. And whilst past me is working on closing up the landing gears, let's talk about a bit the actual aircraft. And as far as I know, there weren't any built because of the complexity of the VTOL system, not even a working prototype. Also, one of the reasons might have been that in mid to late war, the Germans were more pressed to build things that they were already building and had a production line for. But in the meantime, let's glue in the rear landing gear covers as well with some slow drying thick cement. So where was I? Oh yes. So we were talking about this plane not existing because of complexity, but let's think a second about what role it could have had if it would have existed. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because one thing that I didn't like about this build was that Amusing Hobby really dropped the ball on actually doing something cool here. Because all they did was just to copy the existing technical drawings of this aircraft. But those drawings were just, as I said, technical drawings without the consideration of ordnance, like weaponry, radio equipment, or anything. That means we don't really know what kind of role such a plane would have had in the German military. Maybe reconnaissance, maybe close air support, or perhaps maybe anything else, like for example a bomber interceptor with a vertically firing cannon like the Schräge Musik they had on some planes. Who knows? But certainly Amusing Hobby didn't know, so they didn't do anything. And the same goes for the cockpit, because it's not just ordnance that this plane is missing, but a nicely detailed cockpit as well. You have this bottom part which has the bottom of the pilot seat fused to it, and then one lousy control stick, some rudder pedals, and the backrest for the seat. And of course the side walls of the cockpit aren't better either. Which is weird, because one might think that a VTOL aircraft would need way more instruments than this. You know, controlling the direction of the propellers and such. I would imagine you would have a lot of extra stuff in there to be able to take off vertically and then bring the propellers into horizontal position. But maybe that's just me. But let's see how this guy holds on. Well, not that great with his butterfingers. Sadly, on the inside of the cockpit walls there were some nasty ejection pin marks which needed to be filled with some sprue glue. And you can also notice here that I added extra sprue glue for the landing gear covers. You know, just a bit of extra plasticky thickness to it to make sure that nothing bad will happen to them. And after a day's worth of waiting to have the plastic completely cured, I took my trusty handy dandy Dremel and just sanded it down like a champ. Of course you want to be a bit careful, because you don't want to damage anything surrounding surface detail. And for that reason I use this flathead grindy bit. And after I managed to flatten most of the surface with the Dremel, I went in with a 1000 grit sanding sponge to even out the surface a bit more. And then I used some Tamiya Extra Thin to get rid of all the nastiness and have a nice clear, level surface. So let's turn back on the topic of what ifs, and we touched on this plane being either a reconnaissance, a ground support, or perhaps some kind of bomber interceptor. Now the thing is that this plane on paper would have had just one engine giving power to both propellers, which would make me assume that it wouldn't have been a good fighter at all. Oh, but let's stop there for a second, because I am putting in that midsection that would be housing the landing gears. Now, if you're doing closed landing gears like I do, you don't necessarily have to do this, but I did for extra structural support. Now, where were we? Okay, so reconnaissance, bomber interceptor, or ground support. Now, the thing is that for bomber interceptor, it would need to be fast enough in terms of gaining altitude to get to the bombers. Although like a vertical firing gun would help a lot, but it's still a bit flaky, I think, in terms of validity. Now let's put in the front air intake, which is under the nose, and talk about reconnaissance role. Now, with reconnaissance planes, especially on the German side, as far as I remember, you have two crew members. One is the pilot and the other one is doing the reconnaissance thing. But here you have only space for one pilot. So who would do the reconnaissance? I would imagine that flying this aircraft wouldn't be such a breeze, and concentrating on flying this plane and doing reconnaissance might be a bit tricky, or that's what I would think. So reconnaissance is pretty much out, in my opinion. Now let's jump ahead and see how I painted the insides up with RLM66 from Mission Models. Of course, before that I did some priming with Mission Models Grey Primer. Of course, I did the same with the internals, instrument panel, the side panels, instruments, whatever, and the cockpit floor and seat. After that, because I found that this RLM66 is quite dark, I used this very light gray, this Hariokushu gray-green. I don't know if I pronounced it right, probably my Japanese viewers are laughing their asses off. And use that to do some dry brushing to get all the raised detail a bit more popping. Not that it's going to be visible, to be honest, because the cockpit is going to be closed and the canopy is not that big, so you don't have too much visibility, but nevertheless it's a nice thing to sometimes exercise different techniques, even though it's not going to have any visual effect whatsoever in the end. But let's not just stop at the cockpit walls, let's do everything with this light gray or gray-green and get a bit of highlight on everything in the cockpit within, like the instrument panel and the rest of the stuff. And let's continue talking about the roles that this plane could have. So reconnaissance is out, fighter is out, probably bomber interceptor is out. What else? Yeah, close air support. But because it doesn't have too much power, so what kind of ordnance could it take? And here I thought, why wouldn't it take the Naval-Werfer rockets, like here on the picture on a Focke-Wulf 190? And given that it had full armaments and a fuel tank as well, with those two rockets on its wings, we can assume that probably these rockets weren't that heavy, like a 500 or 1,000 pound bomb. And because of the Weserflug aircraft doesn't have any armaments, it could easily carry, in my opinion, 4 of these rockets. And because it's a VTOL aircraft, it can be very close to the front line because it doesn't need big airstrips to land and take off. But anyway, let's continue with other painting, and now we are using RAF Dark Earth to color in the pilot seat. So where was I? Yeah. So it would be close to the front line and it would, in my opinion, behave like an attack helicopter. It would get up, go to the front line, drop its payload, or, well, in this case, it would rocket the hell out of the enemy, and then would get back as fast as possible. It doesn't need to go climb high, it doesn't need to do anything else, just get there, destroy, and then come back. And do it like multiple times in one sortie. I think that would have been a really viable option for this particular aircraft. Of course, you can let me know in the comments if I'm talking out of my ass or not, or that you have better roles for which this aircraft would have been more suitable. I'm not saying that it couldn't be like a good reconnaissance one, but this particular version that Amusing Hobby did, and I think in this setup it wouldn't be good for that. Anyway, my whole point is that I think Amusing Hobby should have done a bit better and give a couple of options in the kit in terms of aircraft role. You know, having rockets, bombs, any kind of other ordnance or armaments on it. That would have been great. But as it is now, it's just a blank canvas. So if you like scratch building or you have any other options like 3D printing, then yeah, it is a great little kit because you can have your imagination running wild. Because it's fairly certain that Amusing Hobby had their imagination locked into a dark and dingy place because they just didn't want it to let it out and thrive with this one. But I'm still going to give them credit for covering this topic, and that the detail, at least on the outside, is quite good. Yes, the internals are lacking and so on and so forth, but the outside detail, the rivets, the panel lines are quite nice. So overall, I would say if you fancy something very different from the generic types, you know, and you want a quick and easy build, I think this kit is for you. I think that's enough for now talking about what ifs and armaments and ordnance, and let's concentrate on the build. And let's color in all the buttons, knobs and levers on the side panels with the same light gray which I used to do the highlighting with the dry brush. And as I said previously, there aren't too many things in the cockpit. On the left hand side you have 2 levers and 2 knobs, buttons kind of things, and on the right hand side there is 1 big button kind of thing. That's about it. And I almost forgot, I also colored in that tiny little button on the left side of the instrument panel. And then using some silver, I colored in the middle section of the control stick. You know, just to give a bit of an extra detail. And then using some black on the top part. And then I decided to use black on the inner lever on the left side. And then putting down some red on the outer bigger lever. And it's a good thing that I actually used the light gray now, because this red would have been dulled down and darkened by the RLM66 if I would have put down the red right on top of that. And I also do the red on the buttons. I actually like it to be red instead of just this gray. And whilst I'm in the red zone, why not have that tiny little button on the instrument panel red as well? Now, using a soft tone shader, I add a bit of texture complexity to the surface of the seat. You could potentially use your Dremel or something to give a physical texture to it as well, but I was a bit lazy and just thought that it's going to be enough to use the shader on it. And now in my infinite wisdom, I use this black quick dry cement from Mr. Hobby on the cockpit internals. What a stupid move. Yeah, the capillary action just managed to get all that stuff around the internal area there. It looks god awful, but luckily it's not going to be visible after you close everything up, so I just left it there. I just cut my losses and said, whatever. Luckily I'm not that stupid as I look, so on the second time I actually used the thick cement to glue in the left side instruments. And actually I should mention that at this point everything was sealed with VMS satin varnish. But at this point I was quite unhappy how the instrument panel looked, because it was quite empty and the kit doesn't provide you with any instrument decals. So I looked around in my decal stash and found that Border Model does give you a lot of extra decals with the Stuka in 1/35 scale, which by the way you can watch how I built that in multiple episodes. But the funny thing is that this is not actually for the Stuka rather than the very first 1/35 scale plane, which is the BF-109G variant. And the best part of these decals is that this is not one big decal sheet. No, the instruments are separate. So I could just pick and choose what fits best in different areas and just put it in there. Like that. And with this extra tidbit, the instrument panel of this plane is going to look much nicer now. And of course you're going to ask, hey, hold on, why does the Stuka have BF-109 decals in the box? And that's because my friend's Border Model forgot to give decals for the BF-109 when it came out, so they rectified it by adding extra decals for the instruments in the Stuka, which was there. I think that was the second plane that they made in 1/35 scale and came after the BF-109. That's why. And after I placed the selected decals in their respectful places, I used this silicone sculpting tool to massage them a bit. You know, you don't have to go full hard mode on them, you know, just use the tip. And after I've done massaging the holes, I am going to fill them up with some UV curing resin and not trying to think of any dirty thoughts. Well, sorry about the blurry image, but you know, this is strictly 18 plus stuff. And now let's cure it with some UV light and see how it will turn out. Lovely, just like the real thing. Now let's do the final touch before we close everything up, and that is to do some panel line wash. With this panel wash from AK, we give a bit of extra depth to the instrument panel and the rest of the cockpit. And after letting the enamel wash dry a bit, like 20 minutes or so, I use a clean brush and some thinner to move the paint around and let it pool up at the edges. Now that everything has dried, let's close this bad boy up. And the fit of the two fuselage halves is quite good, although there is going to be some work around the seam lines, but nothing too serious that our good old friend the sprue glue wouldn't be able to handle. But before we do that, let's close this whole thing up with some quick dry cement. Usually I don't use masking tape to hold things together, but this was one of the occasions where I felt the need to do so. In terms of fit, I think this nose part was the worst one, but you can probably avoid this when you do a bit more dry fitting compared to what I did, and make sure that everything is, oops, butterfingers, that's number 2 now when I drop things. Now get our trusty sprue glue out and fill up all the, well, not gaps really, but the two halves are a bit uneven as they fit together. There is a bit of step, a bit of level difference, and we need to fill that up with sprue glue and then sand it and scrape it back down to make a nice even surface. Now this means that there is going to be some damage to the panel lines and the rivet detail perpendicular to the fuselage, but it shouldn't be a big deal to reapply them after we're done. And of course, one way to make sure that you're not doing more work than absolutely necessary is that you are very careful how you apply the sprue glue on there, just to make sure that it covers all the critical areas, but you're not going to make a mess and damage more surface detail. Now, if this would be anything but sprue glue, like putty or something, then what you could do is that you could run along on both sides of the questionable area some masking tape, and with that you would make sure that the putty doesn't go anywhere. But because it's sprue glue, it's literally melted plastic, it's not going to help that much. Now let's have a look what I did with the rotating wing sections, and I just glued the two halves together and that's about it. It's very simple. Also, these parts needed some sprue glue treatment. Especially this one, as there was a nasty gap kind of thing in the plastic and I needed to fill that up so I can bring the whole surface together and nice and flush. And I also used sprue glue to fill up the inner sides of these rotating wings and of course the parts on the fuselage as well, the wing roots. Now that the fuselage has completely cured, let's break out our trusty Rival scraper and scrape all our problems away. And if there are some problems still left afterwards, you can sand them away with some sanding sponge. And with the really stubborn problems, or the ones which are hard to reach like this one at the intake, you can always use a metal file and just scrape them off as a caveman. There is no problem that good old-fashioned brute force combined with some steel couldn't fix. And then the elegant scraper can come in and nicely level the whole surface. And now that we have rid ourselves from our problems, we have to reintroduce some detail. And first we do the panel lines. And after all the panel lines been done and cleaned up with some extra thin Tamiya cement, we are going to do the rivet detail with a riveting tool. Now these days a lot of them come with different wheels on them, so that the teeth have different distance from each other. So all you have to do is just find the right one where the teeth have the same distance as the rivets have on the plane itself. But even if it's not 100% perfect, it is going to be good enough from a distance. Just make sure that no one leans too close to the plane or use a magnifier to check out all the rivet detail. We don't want to upset them, now do we? So I think, for me, that looks good enough. Now let's move on to the wings midsection, the wing roots. And this comes in 3 parts, the middle top part and 2 bottom halves. Now, as I said it before, these are going to be filled with sprue glue as well and then sanded flush. And before I close this puppy up, I had to glue in the magnet for my magnetic stand with some super glue, like that. And of course you can do the same if you want to have your birds in flight with my stands, links in the description below. But before you go and look at my fly stands, let's finish up this whole build and continue on leveling the surface of the wing roots. And then finally close the whole thing up because it has been like 25 minutes already. Now the elevators come in two parts, you just glue them together and then it's all done. And then you just glue them in place like that. All done. And before we move on to the next operation, let's see how the thing fits together. And both of the shafts of the movable wings have a tiny tab that will lock in place. And it is looking sharp. I quite like actually how this plane looks. It's really interesting. Too bad it was never built. And here we are again talking a bit about the cockpit. Yes, the cockpit is a bit unloved in this kit, and the reason why I'm turning back that behind the pilot's seat there is not much going on. I was thinking perhaps adding some kind of radio equipment or something that would make the whole build a bit more interesting on the inside as well. But then I just opted in putting some plastic sheet, as you can see there, just adding it in there, gluing it in and then filling the gaps on both sides. Now it might sound a bit lazy, but in the end I think it was the best thing to do because, as I said, you're not going to see too much of the cockpit anyway. So if anyone from the Amusing Hobby team watches my videos, I would like to humbly request an upgrade version of this kit with some extra cockpit details and some extra armaments and ordnance and versions and, you know, the things that I talked about like 5 minutes ago. But finally everything is done and we are going to paint. But first let's do some priming, and for that I am going to commit some blasphemy again, the same as what I did with the P.1003 Lightning, and use some Mr. Hobby's Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 as primer. And yes, my friends, it's a lacquer primer, it's not the usual suspect, which is the Mission Models gray primer. I know. I am getting too excited with the lacquer primers now. Anyway, let's give a nice clean coat and see what it gets us. Moving on, using some regular black from AK Virgin Acrylics, we are going to color the propeller blades and the whole prop really. Okay, I think this is too boring. Let's do something more fun. And by fun, I mean let's create some pitot tubes for the plane with brass tubes from Albion Alloys. And for that, I'm going to cut two pieces, one shorter one with 0.9 millimeters, and the other one is going to be 0.7 millimeters in diameter. And you can use your knife just to do some rolling motion and it will cut it clean off. And then sliding both of them together and then gluing them into the nose of the aircraft, we have a nice pitot tube scratch build right there. And this is the other thing, Amusing Hobby. We need a pitot tube on a plane to measure the airspeed. How the hell is the pilot going to know what airspeed they have without a pitot tube? And given how this plane looks, all the designs and everything, You know, with other more regular planes, the pitot tube is in the wings, but here I think it would make most sense to have it right in front of the nose, just like a modern jet. This way it doesn't just look cooler, but it is going to be much faster, at least 20 miles per hour. You know, it has the same effect as when you put some lightning stickers on your car. But enough with the funny stuff. Let's color in the edges of the cockpit area with some RLM 66. And after that we glue on the canopy, then mask it, which I haven't recorded. If you want to see masking videos, then look at my older ones, or if you'd like, I can make a separate video just for masking canopies. But anyway, after that was masked and put in place, I am going to use RLM 66 again to color in the frame. And as I mentioned in my previous video, when I did the P-38 Lightning, I used VMS matte varnish to give a base coat on the clear plastic, because water-based acrylics have a hard time sticking to clear plastics directly. And afterwards, because I already had this very dark gray with RLM 66 loaded into my airbrush, I used it to do some penoline pre-shading. So this means that you take a very dark color, usually black, and you airbrush thin lines over all the penoline detail. Sometimes even the rivet detail as well. And of course, you don't have to be too careful about being blotchy or whatnot, or some pooling. If it's happening, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. It even gives a bit of character that the lines aren't really that clean and they are a bit squiggly and uneven. That's perfectly fine, as later on it will be covered up by the main colors and it will look good overall. And of course we are going to do the same thing on the wings as well. And after this has been done, let's use some RLM 65 from Mission Models. Now I thinned this down to a 40% paint, 60 thinner, just to have a really thin layer build up that I usually want to achieve. Nice and easy, nice and slow, there is no rush, just layer by layer until you are satisfied how it looks. We don't want to lose all this pre-shading detail that we just made. One thing to keep in mind, that when you do like these soft edges and transitions between paints, that you want to roughly know where one coat ends and one coat begins, because you don't want to end up losing all the pre-shading detail for having 2 or even 3 coats of paint on top of it. And of course you also want to avoid a situation where the bottom paint and the top paint aren't really meeting each other in the position where you actually want them to be in. But let's move on, as this part is pretty much done. And let's concentrate on the top surfaces now. And first we are going to do the greens. Now this kit came with 3 color schemes, and from all these 3 I found this one the most interesting. Although I liked the Night Fighter as well. But again, let's be honest here, because this plane didn't have any armament or anything, is it really good to have a Night Fighter camo scheme or Night Bomber? It doesn't have a radar, and there is no options for a radar in the kit. So why would you even, amusing hobby, why would you even give this option? It just doesn't make any sense. But let's not delve into that topic any longer. And of course, to make matters worse, I also didn't choose a German Luftwaffe approved color for this green, because I went with number 1 light green, which is Federal Standard 34151. So my reasoning here for this is really that we are already through the looking loss when it comes to realism, because this is pretty much a what if plane, so I think it doesn't really matter what kind of color you use on it. And I also think that the Luftwaffe colors, well, the green ones, are very, very dark, and I just wanted to have some kind of lighter green to accompany the dark brown that I'm going to put on later. And we can also assume that the German Air Ministry might come out with a different color scheme in their regulations, and they might choose something lighter than before. We will never know what Herr Göring would have wanted in 1946. But let's not get carried away about what's and hows and whys and what colors. Let's see what I'm doing here in the past, and that is putting down this green in islands, so there isn't going to be too much of an overlap between the top coats. And with this I'm trying to actually avoid, not to lose too much of the preceding detail. And I'm also, as you can see, I'm trying to paint on the green a bit blotchy, a bit mottled, so it's not an even coverage. I want to give some weathered look to it. And I know that the true masters of this hobby do like multiple layers of mottled paint, with different lightness and shade of the same color, just to give that really, really weathered effect. And I do appreciate that work, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that I'm on that level just yet, so I'm pretty much happy with how this looks. And I think this still has that feel of that weathered look, but I'm not going to, mix like 3 different shades of the same green. Is it just me, or it really feels like that aircraft modelers started to mimic the tank bros? Because when I watch these YouTube videos, a lot of the, mainly the big channels, the big names, are doing so much weathering on some of the planes that I think if a plane would look like that in real life, that plane would be sitting in a garbage heap waiting for recycling and not on an active airfield. But again, to be clear here, I'm not talking negatively about these modelers' skills, because I am really, really jealous about how good they are, and I'm hoping that one day I will be at least halfway there with my skills as where they are right now. But I just cannot shake the feeling that we are overdoing it. Some of the things we are overdoing at this point, and it is just for eye candy. But maybe that's just me. Do let me know in the comments if you feel the same way, or that I'm just full of beans. Talking about beans, let's do the browns next. And you might have guessed that if I'm not using standard Luftwaffe colors for the greens, I might do the same with the browns. And you wouldn't be wrong, because this brown, my friends, is RAF Dark Earth, the same brown that I used in the cockpit for the pilot seat. And that's not just because I had that paint already out and I might be too lazy to, get a different brown. Maybe true, but because I already used a lighter green than the usual ones in the Luftwaffe, it might be beneficial to use a lighter brown, so there is not that big of a color contrast between the 2 top coats. I know it sounds crazy, but hey, in the end I think it really looks good and I quite like the outcome. So the brown and the green stays. You have to just live with my decisions now. Same as the green, I tried to put on this brown as blotchy and mottled as possible to give a bit of weathered effect to it. And the thing that I did very differently from the example that Amusing Hobbies gave in the instructions is that the tail surface, well, the vertical stabilizer was completely mottled, with Oralam 65 as the base coat and the green and the brown being blotchy and mottled all around. And after done with the painting, I sealed everything in with VMS satin varnish. Again, I'm not being sponsored, but man, VMS varnishes are fantastic, highly recommended. In every video I keep on saying this until you buy some, because they are that good. So go and buy some VMS satin varnish, matte varnish, gloss varnish, doesn't matter which one you like or want, all of them are great. Go and get some. Now everything being sealed and ready for decaling. Sadly, there aren't too many decals with this kit because there is no stencil information, which is understandable in this case. But on the other hand, what I would say is that these decals are really good. Now I don't know if these are cartograph ones or not, but I have the suspicion that they aren't. Usually cartograph decals are more shiny, and this has like a satin or close to matte surface finish. Well, the decals I mean. And they are really good. They go down really well. They respond to the softening and setting solution really well. They go into the surface detail really well. They are really good decals. I highly praise these decals. So all the decals that were left over, I will put them away because I intend to use them in the future. They are so good. And of course I'm going to use my usual technique of rolling and rubbing, which means that you put down the setting solution, put the decal on top, and then using a cotton bud, first you roll it across the decal. So you will remove the liquid from underneath, but you are not going to move the decal because you're not dragging it potentially with the rolling motion. And when that's done and the decal seems to be in place and it hasn't moved and you're happy, then you can rub and then finalize everything. And with the rubbing, you push down the decal onto the surface. Of course, rubbing is optional. Sometimes, like here, the decals are so good that only rolling is enough. But the golden rule is you roll before you rub, because if the other way around, you're going to have a bad time. And for extra spiciness, I took some decals from another kit that I have, which is this one, the JUEF 126 LE from Das Werk. And I'm going to use one of these Geschwader emblems on the nose of the plane. I know it's a bit oversized, and I also know that that emblem with the wolf's head is for the Group 3 of Jagdgeschwader 77, which is a fighter group and not a bombing one. But it's artistic freedom, and I liked how it looked, so I went with it. And also, don't mention it, but I know I actually put it the other way around. The wolf's head should look to the left and not to the right. I know. And with all the decaling done, let's move on and do some panel lining. And here I'm using AK enamel panel, which I had for years now. This is a very dark one for greens and browns, which is actually perfect given what the two types of colors I used are on the top surface. Usually I would go all in, but here I'm just doing very thick lines along all the panel lines, because there are a lot of rivet detail next to the panel lines, which I also want to emphasize with the wash. And now you can see that yeah, the recording quality is quite bad. This was taken the same time when some parts of my P.1003 video were, and yeah, it's a bit of a slideshow, so frames are missing from it. I do apologize, but I of course fixed the issue, so in the future this shouldn't happen anymore, hopefully. And after I've been done with all the enamel panel wash application, I waited for 15 to 20-30 minutes or so to have it dried but not completely cured, and I took some blue tack and started rubbing away the excess. I found that blue tack is really good to remove enamel and oil paints from satin or even matte surfaces, and I really like this technique. Although after a while, if the blue tack has too much oil paint in it, it will destroy it and you have to get more of it. But you can see how nice and clean the surface is here. It just looks really good. I highly recommend this technique if you don't want to do like glossy varnish before you apply the panel lines and then put on a satin on top of that. But moving on, I am using a black AK Real Color marker to color in the exhausts. I thought about drilling them, but these pieces are so tiny that from the fear of damaging them potentially, I just opted in coloring them black and be happy with that. And as the still image shows, it's okay. It's not perfect. Certainly drilling them out properly would make them much nicer, but I just had the fear that if I'm going to start drilling, I might damage them, and yeah, I just didn't have the feel to try to recreate these with my 3D printer. But talking about 3D printing now, because we talked about that we are going to put the Weserflug rockets on there, I used my resin printer and my relatively limited CAD designer knowledge and recreated these rocket pods from some technical documents. I used RLM65 to color them in. The inside I used matte aluminum, or aluminium for the British, and then I used some super glue in the end to glue them to the inner wing roots, because, well, you don't want to have them on the moving wings, right? Especially that the props are so big that they would obscure the openings, and the rocket would probably smash into the propeller and kill the pilot and destroy the whole plane. And for the rockets themselves, I used Elfenbein, which is like this creamy white that was used in the tanks, in the Panzers, as an internal color. I was thinking about what kind of color I would use, but I opted for that to have it much lighter, so you can actually see the rockets inside of the pods. And moving on, I'm using some aluminum, or aluminum for the Americans, from AK Extreme Metals lineup. It's an enamel paint, and I do some sponge chipping. And you might have noticed that for the last minute or so, I've been using just still images instead of videos, and that's because all of these recordings were hot garbage. It was such a slideshow that I thought that it's going to be just much simpler to show some images like this one. I do apologize for it. It's not going to happen in the future. And I think we came to the very end of this long-winded build of a very simple kit. So here is the grand reveal. And yay indeed. I am very happy how this turned out. It is a really nice kit. And yes, of course, it is lacking in certain departments, as I said in this video previously. Overall, I highly recommend this kit if you want to build something very unconventional. And I'm very curious what amusing hobby will come out in the future. Although I do have 2 kits from them. One of them is in the making. I'm not going to tell you which one. And I recently bought another one. I might make an unboxing on that because I haven't been doing any unboxings lately. I do lack the unboxing skills apparently. One thing, of course, that again I would message to Amusing Hobby, that please make an updated version of this kit by adding some extras like antennas for a night fighter or recon plane, you know, adding some gun pods or these rockets or bombs even, I don't know, whatever, you know. Play with the ideas, people. Anyway, now that the build is done, you are free to go and have a look at my flight stands if you so wish. Just follow the links in the description below. You can go either to Etsy or eBay or to my personal site as well. And if you want to see high definition images, yeah, you can go to my gallery and then have a look around there. And of course, at the end, I always say that please like and subscribe, and see you on the next one. Bye bye.